Hi, I hope you'll enjoy the episode you're about to listen to, but you should know that this podcast would not be possible without the generous support of some of our listeners who contribute either through Patreon or directly on our Buzzsprout website. I'd like to thank Brian Heyer, Brandon and Sarah Gierach, Steve Zank, Scott Henrich, Deborah Hilger, Mikhail Legner, Abigail Anoa Broyles, and Rosa. Thank you. I do want to ask you a little bit now to switch gears and talk about your role as professor at MLC, Martin Luther College in New Ulm, teaching German. You just gave an excellent historical podcast interview with us, but you're not the history professor, you're the German professor. But
right.
In my mind, though, taking class with you, once we got past I think I tested into German too, but once we got past the grammar, I made sure I had that all sorted out. German class with you suddenly turned into more of a history German and theology class. So that leads me to ask you a few questions now, if you'll entertain them. What is the goal and purpose of the German program at the Synod's Ministerial Educational School at Martin Luther College?
Yeah, ultimately what we would hope is that German would win a student's heart so that he would use it for the good of fellow pastors, for the good of the church body, for the good of confessional Lutheranism as a whole. We have a long history and a rich heritage of literature that exists only in German. I think a good example of this is Heineke's Dogmatics. Heineke was actually the first guy, the first confessional Lutheran in America to write a Lutheran Dogmatics. But now I'm thinking back to my own days as a seminary student. I actually think that Pieper's Dogmatics is more well known. When I was a student at the seminary, that was the dogmatics I think that we read. For this maybe obvious reason, Heineke's Dogmatics didn't exist in English. It was nearly 100 years before the Wisconsin Synod took the time to translate Heineke's Dogmatics into English. And by then, Pieper's Dogmatics, also originally written in German, had already been in English for 50 years practically. We have lots of stuff. Retired Pastor James Langbartels has done just a tremendous amount of translating. Arnie Lehman has done a tremendous amount of translating, but there is so much more to be done. All of our proceedings, all of our conference essays, Heineke has an entire year's worth of sermons, the vast majority of which haven't been translated. He has all of these articles in the Gemeindeblatt. All these years of the Gemeindeblatt beyond Heineke haven't been translated. All of this stuff is out there, a rich theological history and heritage. I think what might be, I'm not sure about this, but what might be the only copy of Heineke's class notes for his pastoral theology course, over 500 pages. This has to be transcribed, first of all, into a script that we can read. It's the old handwritten script in German, but then translated into English. This is what we would want ultimately for our German program to accomplish, to equip young men with the interest and the ability to do this. You know, you can go on a website like the Post-Reformation Digital Library, and it's just amazing to me. I can click on a book that was published in the 16th century. And there it is. I can take a look in digital format at the exact same book that some Lutheran held in the 1500s. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of books on this website, not just in German, but in Latin. And they're all, many of them, I should say, waiting to be read and translated.
Yeah, it's kind of a crying shame that, with the transition into English, as good as that may be for our current setting, and of course that's what we speak. What else would we do as a starting point, right? And for mission work, English is a wonderful language, and so many learn it. But to almost be totally disconnected, to almost have like to set ourselves up for amnesia of our theological heritage if it hasn't been translated. So, yeah, I can definitely see the role and the purpose of just knowing German. Now, what can you tell us about some of the things, more of like topics or authors that you've looked at over the years with your classes as they are able to read now some of this theological German?
Yeah, as you mentioned, once we get by the grammar, though I am a grammar guy, I love my grammar.
That's
We do
important.
get into, theological German. The first thing that we do is a course called Luther German. And the main thing we read there is a simple way to pray. I've been amazed over the years. I understand this exists in English, and yet I think it lends itself well as a first step into theological German. It occupies itself with the Lord's Prayer, with the Ten Commandments, and then just a little bit with the Apostles' Creed. So these are topics guys already know something about. This takes them back to their catechism instruction days and confronts them with, it's not a great word to use, provides them with the opportunity to begin to develop a basic theological German vocabulary. What always surprises me is how much guys say they just enjoy the content there. You'd think, well, these young men studying theology, what joy would they find in these short little excerpts on these catechetical topics? And yet, year in and year out, they enjoy them immensely. We move on then to the Survey of Theological German. We take the history of confessional Lutheranism from 1546, Luther's death, through 1930, what I kind of think about as the heyday of the Synodical Conference. We divide that up into 4 periods, and we look at some of the leading confessional Lutheran theologians in each of those periods, guys like Johannes Brentz, Martin Chemnitz, a guy maybe a lot of people don't know, Valentin Löscher, Johann Gerhardt, Paul Gerhardt, another guy people maybe don't know, Friedrich Brunn. And then, of course, names people do recognize, Steckhart, Walther, Heinecke. And then we end with what I think is a wonderful article, the foreword to volume 10 of the Theologische Quartalschrift by Pieper, where he talks about being theologians of the scriptures, Schrifttheologie, and not being theologians of the fathers, Vätertheologie, draws heavily, here's another plug for German, on lessons learned from the election controversy. There are a couple of electives that we also offer. The first one is European German Lutheran Writings. I've been looking lately, especially at Friedrich Brunn. I think that's a guy worth knowing more about. He actually is one of the first confessional Lutherans of the Free Church movement in Germany. He has very close ties with the Missouri Synod, with early on, he has close ties with Lea, with the Breslau Synod, with the Emmanuel Synod, and actually becomes one of the founding fathers of what is today our sister synod in Germany, the Evangelisch-Lutherische Freikirche, the ELFK. I've been spending a couple of years on him. The other course we have is American German Lutheran writings. There, I've done a number of things. I've spent a number of years on Wyneken. I've spent a number of years on J.P. Kaler. I've spent some time on the election controversy. I've spent some time on a controversy on justification in the early years of the Synodical Conference. So sometimes it's people, sometimes it's topics that are covered in those electives. So that's what we do in the German program, the theological German side of things.
Yeah, and as I've already mentioned, the connection of theology, history, and German. But anything else you have to say about how theology, history, and German, especially for us in the Wisconsin Synod, how they just go hand in hand, how they naturally are mutual topics of study?
I was reading recently a paper by Peter Prange. I mentioned this to you before we started. When it came time for him to do his history of the Wisconsin Synod, he was looking for primary source material. And apparently the Wells was famous for not really having that kind of stuff, for not putting a lot of stock, energy, effort into preserving its history. And so Kaler goes to visit Boding, this guy who is so key to the leadership of the Wisconsin Synod for so many years, and he's trying to find out, what primary source material do we have? And Boding apparently finds in his attic bundles of letters that he's using as insulation. And these are a treasure trove for Kaler as he is putting together his history of the Wisconsin Synod. I think of something else I heard once. I think it was from Jim Unke, who is related, if you go back, to August Pieper. And there's a binder of Pieper sermons, I think, that has been turned over to the Wells archives. And there again, it just sits there waiting for somebody to tell us what it says, to translate those sermons into English. I saw recently James Langbartels translated a whole bunch of Wells proceedings and put them into English for us, continuing the work of Arnie Lehman. But there are other proceedings to be translated. There are convention essays to be translated. There's all those years of the Gemeindeblatt to be put into English. There's a lot of stuff from the Kortalschrift that's been translated into English, but there's a lot of stuff that hasn't. That's our history. That's our heritage. And German is the door through which we need to be able to walk if we're not going to lose that access.
Yeah, and that speaks well to why learning German is still important for the Wisconsin Synod today. Before you can translate it, you have to know the language, and that kind of goes back to the fundamental importance of learning German for our synod. And I can't really think of a time or a phase in my life since graduating from the seminary where I haven't probably gone a month without needing to read something in German. Now need is kind of a subjective word, right? You ever really need to do it, but I found myself relying on those German skills and putting them to use and sharing them. Just recently, I unintentionally found myself translating a chapter of Moldenke's autobiography that he wrote, and chapter 3 is on being a Reiseprediger, and it just goes into oodles of fascinating anecdotes of traveling up and down the Minnesota River Valley and almost dying about 10 times, it seems, just to spread the gospel. And how would you understand that without German? So I thought I'd translate that, and I think that will be in the Historical Institute coming up in
I just read something else you had translated that was in there.
But sorry, what was that?
I just read something else you had translated that
Oh
was.
yeah, that was also an accident. One of my friends who also was in a German class with you, Peter Plagans, is a pastor. He shared a box of books with me, and lo and behold, here was a 1917 400th anniversary of the Reformation history book, and in the back, um, August Ernst, our Northwestern College president for a while, had written a little mini history of the Wisconsin Synod, and there it was, just waiting to be unlocked. So I did that in about one afternoon because it was short enough. But all these fascinating little things that you need to know German, or else you lose out on it.
And there's another guy we need to know more about, August Ernst, his long time at
Yeah,
Northwestern, his long time in leadership positions of our federation. And again, I think German's the key there.
yeah. Well, I guess my last thing I want to ask you about, and to see how not I or others perhaps listening to this podcast episode, how can we encourage the study of German in general, but most of all in the Wisconsin Synod? And I know there are a lot of Missouri Synod listeners too, basically in the same exact situation, a German Synod with a lot of German materials waiting to be translated.
Well, you're tossing me a softball here, Ben, and I appreciate it tremendously. We are at an important time in Wisconsin Synod history for the study of the confessional languages. It's the nature of education, it's the nature of curricula that they change over time. And we are at a time of change right now in our program of pre-seminary training. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, how closely or well you read various synodical publications. In my day, when I was a student, I didn't have a choice. I had to take German, and I had to take Latin, 5 years of Latin and 4 years of German. And then things changed, and you could do either German or Latin. And then things changed, and you could do either German or Latin or Spanish. And all of these, there are reasons for these changes that all make good sense. Well, we are starting next year having another change. Now you can do German or Latin or Spanish, and this is still our recommendation and our preference, but a pre-seminary student could also elect to do something else, something that's not a non-biblical language. And so it is going to become exceedingly important that we encourage young men to give serious consideration to the study, especially of German and Latin, these languages of the Lutheran Church's history and heritage, these doors to the past. We don't want to see them closed. Now, we're going to do what we can on campus here in order to incentivize students to do that. And I suppose what I mean by that, to be as forthright as I can, is we're going to offer young men some money. We have established the Confessional Language Scholarship. And we know that college is expensive. And while this isn't going to, pay the bill, it's a little help along the way. And it's a way of us saying to young men, you know what, this is important. We'll offer you a scholarship if you are willing to do this thing for the history and heritage of the Wisconsin Synod and Confessional Lutheranism. But I happen to think that the most critical thing we can do is, Ben, to rely on guys like you, parish pastors, pastor dads, to say to their sons, to say to the young men in their congregation who are studying for pastoral ministry, hey, I see in you these gifts. And it might not be the easiest thing to do. It might not be the first thing that you want to do. but I see that God has given you the gifts to study German, to study Latin, to study Spanish. I see that God has given you the gifts, and I want to encourage you as my son, as a member of my congregation. Would you please consider doing this for your church, for confessional Lutheranism? You know, I think probably what happens, the reality of parish life is that parish pastors who don't have the same drive that you do, you know, they let their German and they let their Latin get away from them. And they tell their sons, they tell the members of their congregation, Greek and Hebrew really matter. Make sure you learn Greek and Hebrew. But we're at a time in our church body where I think we need to go beyond that and say to our sons, to the members of our congregation, God has given you the gifts. We need you to make sure you do what you can to keep that door open, regardless how a pastor might personally feel about the study of German or Latin. I think all pastors would agree. You look down the road 50 years from now, this door needs to remain open for us as a church body.
I'm very happy to give you that opportunity here. I hope our listeners take your words to heart, and I guess I don't have anything else to say but amen to that. We'll be putting a link in the podcast description, very easy for you to find if you'd like to. I believe you can support this scholarship. Am I correct? Yeah, support that scholarship to incentivize people in that way. But I think Professor Danell's point is well taken. This is something that needs to be talked about. If you're listening to this episode, you have benefited, whether or not you realize it or not, from people who have learned German. There wouldn't be much Lutheran history to talk about if German skills weren't involved in this English language podcast somewhere along the way. So with that, Professor Danell, thank you so much for your time, being able to talk about Professor Adolf Wyneken and his influence in the Wisconsin Synod, and of course, the importance of learning and using German.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate your podcast. It is my companion as I travel here and there by myself to tune in and see what's going on, catch up on missed episodes. I try not to miss any.
I really appreciate that as well. Thank you.